Hi there, everyone. We're just going to, of course, wait a few minutes. We have a full slate of attendees, so hopefully we will see them all very soon. And I will ask that you all mute yourself. That was supposed to happen automatically, but perhaps not. Just doing a sound check. If you hear me, if you could, someone could chat back and say that they can, or give me a thumbs up. Perfect. Thanks very much. Here you go. First problem or first mistake of Zoom calls is to talk while you're muting yourself. We're just going to give it a few more minutes and allow people to join us, and then we will begin.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Christiana, sorry. My brain is a little off today.
It's okay.
Yeah, it's a Friday, I think, for everyone. So
Yeah.
hopefully people will join us as we go, but I'm just going to introduce myself. So for those of you who have someplace to be before too terribly long. So my name is Anna Purkey, and some of you may, I see a few familiar names, people who may know me as the current treasurer and the conference organizer for the Canadian Association for Forced CARFMS, for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies. So I'm the organizer for the 2022 conference, which will be in just under 2 weeks. So starting on a week from next Wednesday. I am also presenting these workshops, obviously in part as a result of that workshop, but also for a wider audience, for people who are interested in, especially for graduate students who might be preparing to present at their first conference or thinking about doing so. As a member of CARFMS, one of the things we want to do, or one of our mandates, is to create a community of knowledge and also to create a community of scholarship. And part of that means doing mentorship. And so I believe that one of the ways we can do that is through this sort of workshop or skills-based workshops. So today we're going to be talking about how to present at a conference. Now, many of you have already probably done this. And so some of what I say is going to be old hat, as we say. It's an expression that means that you've seen it, you've done this before. Hopefully there will be a few tips and tricks that you might not know about or that might be useful to you. And then at the end, I'll also open it up to discussion to see if any of you have advice for some of your fellow grad students, new scholars. So to begin with, I see more people are joining, which is awesome. So we're going to start by looking at a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to speak as we do the PowerPoint. Obviously, we are presenting online, and for those of you who are presenting at the CARFMS conference, it will be an online conference. So some of the tips I'm going to give you are going to be specifically geared towards presenting online, but many of them will not be, and many of them, there are also specific tips for presenting in person as well. So let us start. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And here we go. Slideshow. All right, so can everyone see? Can somebody give me a thumbs up to make sure that you can see my presentation? Perfect. All right. So this is our Canadian Association for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies tips and tricks for presenting at a conference. But it actually, to be fair, a lot of this is presenting in a workshop format, even teaching. There are some of these tricks that can be helpful for that as well. So this is our topic, or a list of topics for today. We're going to start with a brief introduction, and then we're going to focus on content. So what should be in your presentation? We're going to look at the visuals. What should your presentation look like? In many instances, we use PowerPoint or some other visual software. Some people use Prezi. So what are the good things and bad things to do about that? And I'm sure that you've all seen a presentation at some point where you saw a PowerPoint and just thought, oh my gosh, why has this person done it? Then there are going to be some tips about delivery. So that's actually, how do you present once you are in the room, in the conference room? What are important things to think about for presenting? Then some troubleshooting. So there are some common challenges that come up. And then last but not least, questions. So for the questions, you can potentially, the easiest will be to put them into the chat, and I will go through them at the end. If you have questions throughout, you can post them. It's a little bit hard for me to deal with both the questions and the presentation at the same time, so I might come back to them at the end if that's all right. So first off, the introduction. So in the introduction, I decided that what I would do is I'd give you my absolute most important point. So the key point when you are thinking about building your conference presentation is to build the presentation within the given constraints. And there are a variety of different constraints. The biggest and most important one is time. And I will come back to that again in a minute, and I will come back to that again throughout the presentation. One is also location. So the actual physical space that you are going to be in. One is audience. Who is your audience? Are you speaking to undergraduate students? Are you speaking to a graduate audience? Are you speaking to experts in the field, people who know about what you're talking about? And then, of course, format. So your format could be online, it could be virtual, it could be in person, it could also be a poster presentation. It could be a round table, or it could be a formal conference presentation. And how you design what you are going to say, how you are design that presentation will depend on all of these factors. But I'm going to come back to the main one, which is time. I'm sure if you have attended a conference, you have seen a situation where someone starts out, they get through perhaps 4, 5, 6 of their slides, and then they're told that they have 3 minutes left. And then they panic and start flipping through their slides quickly because they have 25 different slides and a dozen different things that they want to say. And what you will come away from when you hear a presentation like that is, first of all, you won't actually remember the content most of the time. What you will come away feeling is that this is a presenter who was really disorganized and who was not prepared. In fact, they may have over-prepared, insofar as they prepared way more material than they could actually present, but they didn't prepare their presentation within the confines, within the constraints of what they were given. So one of the first things to find out when you are giving a presentation is how much time. And if they tell you you have 10 minutes, you have 10 minutes. You don't have 15 minutes, you don't have 12 minutes. You have 10 minutes. It is disrespectful to the other panelists and honestly to your audience if you try to extend over that. And so that's really, really key when you are designing your presentation. You must stick to the time allotted, and your presentation has to be tailored to that time frame. What I do for a 30-minute presentation versus an hour-and-a-half class versus a 10-minute conference presentation is going to be very different. And my objectives for each of those are going to be very different as well. So speaking of objectives, let's move on to the next, content. And this is a key idea. When you are doing a presentation, you are trying to get people interested in reading your work. You are not trying to tell them everything that you have done. So you are trying to start a conversation. You are not lecturing. And this is where the difference between an hour-and-a-half class versus a 10-minute presentation, especially if it's something on which you've already written, on which you have an article, or maybe you're planning an article. You're really trying to grab your audience's interest, as opposed to simply saying, I have this research project and that I've been working on for the last 2 years, and this is everything that I have found in the last 2 years. You're not going to be able to do that in a 10-minute conference presentation. So to this end, when you're thinking about the content, and you have to think about the content at the very beginning, what are you trying to say in this presentation? Keep your goal in mind. And that goal is to get people interested in your work. That's in terms of a conference presentation at an academic conference. If you're presenting, for instance, before an NGO, or if you are a member of an NGO, your objective may be different. If you're presenting to a policy audience, your objective may be different. It may be to convince them of a particular point. But again, it's all about thinking about your objective and keeping that in mind in terms of how you design your presentation. So the second tip that I have, so the first is to keep your goal in mind. And it is both the goal of your research and also, perhaps more importantly, the goal of your presentation. The second tip has to do with simplicity. You want to keep your talk simple and straightforward. And to that end, I generally recommend that you identify very specific takeaways and start there. So you're starting at the end of your presentation. When someone finishes listening to you, what do you want them to remember? They're not going to remember everything. Most of us, when we're going to a conference, we are seeing maybe 3, 4, or 5 presentations or panels, and each panel has 3 or 4 presentations in it in a single day. So think about the amount of information overload that your audience is subject to. So you want to make 1 to 3 really important, strong points very clearly. Those are your takeaways. It doesn't mean that that's the only thing you say, but those are the things you will outline in your introduction, you will develop them in your content, and then you will reiterate them in your conclusion. So stick to those 3. That should be identified right from the beginning. Your presentation is going to be, as I said, one of many that people listen to, and you want it to stand out. Another way to tailor your presentation is to know your audience. And this is what I was talking about earlier in terms of the constraints. So if I'm talking to students, what I say to them is going to be very different than what I say when I'm presenting to an expert audience. So for instance, if you happen to be presenting at the CARFMS conference in a couple weeks, you can be pretty sure that most of the people in the audience will have a basic understanding of forced migration. Will know what a refugee is. Will know what an internally displaced person is. Will know what a stateless person is. So that's important because it means you don't need to, first of all, waste time explaining the definition of a refugee to your audience. But you also don't, one of the challenges is if you have an expert audience and you take the time to explain to them, what a refugee is, they're going to feel like you're talking down to them. And that means that you're most likely going to lose some people's attention right from the beginning. So think about your audience when you're designing your presentation. Who are they? What are they interested in as well? What part of your research might appeal to them? What do you want to share with these specific people? So that's what I would say about knowing your audience. And it's important, I should say, you want to tailor your message to your audience. So don't give the same presentation to just anyone. Be aware of who it is you are speaking to. The next one is to engage your audience. And again, this goes back to that idea of trying to make your presentation memorable and also being aware of the fact that your audience may be suffering from information overload. Engaging your audience can be done in a variety of different ways. But going back to the idea of what you are trying to achieve, one of the things you want to do is you want to tell your audience why your research is interesting, why it is important. And so you need to pull them in. There are different ways of doing this. One good way that people often use will be to use stories. So personal anecdotes. If you've done empirical research, you might have a particular story that was really striking for one reason or another. Don't spend all 10 minutes about it, but just bringing that in at the beginning can be what we refer to as the hook. It's the way of literally hooking your audience, getting them interested in what you're talking about. A question also works. So using rhetorical questions, a question you're asking your audience, something for them to think about, which you are then going to go on and answer. Now, obviously, these things have to be related to your topic. We've probably all seen, I don't know if, for instance, if you watch Big Bang Theory and, where the main characters are presenting at a conference and they start off with telling a joke because you're supposed to tell a joke to get people engaged, but the joke has nothing to do with the subsequent presentation. Don't do that. Your hook needs to be a good use of your time. You have a limited amount of time in which to get your points across. So this is it, thinking about what is your goal? Keep your goal in mind. What are the key takeaways that you want your audience to understand? What do you want them to get from your presentation? Know who your audience is, and the key takeaways will be dependent on who your audience is as well. So I will want a policy audience to take away something different from my research than I want my undergraduate students. And then the ability to engage your audience. One way to work on some of this, and here's my trick, so is, for instance, to look at some TED Talks, short talks that have received a lot of views online. It may seem silly, but these are people who are very, in many instances, have done a lot of public speaking, and looking not at the content. The content is obviously going to be different, but looking at how they structure their talks is quite interesting. Now, most of those are not academic, but you will see that there are very clear, specific points that they are trying to get across. The worst thing you can do is try to throw your entire research project at your audience from start to finish. I've seen research presentations where people start out telling you what their objectives were, then they tell you the entire methodology, and then they start on the analysis. And first of all, what inevitably happens is they run out of time. And when they run out of time, they generally don't ever get to the conclusion. Because as I said, if you have 10 minutes, at the end of 10 minutes, you're going to be cut off. So you need to remember that those 3 points, that's really all you can make effectively in 10 minutes. That's all the time you have. So pick and choose those carefully. Now, we'll come back to content, and I'm sure you may have some questions about this. But the next part are the visuals. So I wouldn't necessarily use what I have done here as an example. And visuals, it depends. There are certain formats that are more, where visuals are more necessary. So for instance, I'm more likely to use a PowerPoint presentation in a formal conference presentation. I'm probably not going to use one in a roundtable. Similarly, if you're doing a poster presentation, then you don't actually get the pitch. You're not doing the conference presentation so much as the visuals become much more important. I'm talking more about visuals for a very traditional 10 to 15-minute conference presentation. So the first thing that I would say is do not start with your PowerPoint. Start with the content. Problem is that we get the PowerPoint, we start creating slides, you start adding and adding and adding, and then you realize before long that your presentation has grown and is far beyond those initial constraints that we talked about. So start from the basics. The presentation, the visual part of the presentation should be the last thing that you are doing before you present. Well, actually, the last thing you should do is practice, but before that, the visuals. So first, as I said, start with your content. Decide what your content is going to be, decide the structure of your argument or of your presentation, and that will give you an idea of how you can structure your presentation visually. Similarly, when you have an idea of what the constraints are, it will give you a much better idea of what you need in terms of a visual presentation. So for instance, if I have a 10-minute presentation, I'm not going to have time to get through 30 slides. And if I've started with my PowerPoint presentation, that might be really disappointing because I've put so much work into it and I'm not going to get to use most of it. So start with your content and then move on to the visuals. Be strategic. Visuals should supplement, not distract. And this is a perfect example. When I put this up, how many of you stop listening to me and start reading the cartoon? I know my students do it all the time. And so in this instance, although it is a good cartoon, the cartoon is actually distracting you from what I am saying. So your visuals, whether you're using PowerPoint or Prezi or some other form of visual software, they need to be, they need to supplement your verbal message. So the main way you are conveying your message in a conference is verbally. So these are here to support what you are saying, not to distract from it. Visuals can be very powerful. They can be used to reaffirm a particular point. They can be used to highlight a particular point and to reinforce your message, but they can also be really distracting. And so you need to keep the visuals under control. A slide that has 3 or 4 different images on it and lines and lines and lines of text is just going to be distracting. We don't multitask as well as we think we do. So the idea that people will be able to listen to you and read what you have on your presentation is a little bit of a deception. When I am reading what is on the PowerPoint behind you, I'm only half listening to what you are saying. And if I lose the thread of what you are saying, the problem is that I'm not going to be able to get it back very easily. So your visuals need to be done with that in mind, that they really have to supplement what you're saying. They can be used to repeat what you say, but they can't distract. And so that means that they have to coincide with what you are saying verbally. If my visual says something completely different, then it's going to be really hard for your audience to pay attention to both. They're going to have to pick which they are paying attention to. So if, as I said, if the visuals are too busy, then your audience is going to focus on them and they are not going to be focused on you, and you don't want that. Generally avoid too many animations. So I have things coming in slowly. That's not the end of the world, but I don't know if any of you have played around with the various new versions of PowerPoint, but there are all sorts of fancy things you can have your text do and your images do. And again, this is a question of, first of all, sometimes it doesn't look very professional. but it can also be distracting. And this goes for also choosing your background or your theme for a presentation as well. Think about the fact that it's going to be viewed from a distance. It may be a dark room, but it may also be a very bright room. So think about that when you're looking at what color of background you use, what color of text. So if, for instance, I had black print on this PowerPoint, nobody would be able to see it. I use yellow as a highlight, but even that I would only use very sparingly because it's actually difficult for some people to read that contrast. So be aware of those details when you are actually building the visual part of your presentation. Curate the text very carefully. This is, again, a super common mistake that a lot of people make, which is that they overload their PowerPoint presentations with text. And again, this goes back to the idea that if I am reading your presentation, I am not listening to you fully. Text on PowerPoint presentations should be very minimal. So for instance, point form, sometimes I would use a definition. So something I want my audience to keep in mind as I am talking. So I'm going to be giving them more details, but that definition, which I've already told them verbally, I want them to be able to keep in mind and to refer back to. So that's another way you could use it. But it really needs to be easy to see. That means using an appropriate type, an appropriate font, and not overloading it. This isn't trying to get your entire essay or term paper onto a PowerPoint slide for people to listen to. And this goes back then to that idea of content and limiting your content. Because when you don't limit your content, that's when you end up overloading people with information on the PowerPoints because you realize you're not actually going to be able to cover it all verbally. So images, if you have the opportunity to use images, if, for instance, in your research you are presenting statistics, that's a great opportunity to see them visually, put them on your PowerPoint. If you have a graph, if you have a map is a very helpful thing. So again, use your visuals strategically. This is my own personal trick, and I use this for my classes when I'm teaching. I put a little note in my notes, so I highlight certain words in my notes where I am supposed to change the slide. So when you're going to click, some of you may have had the experience where a person talks and they talk and talk and talk, and then they get back to their PowerPoint and they realize that they haven't changed the slide for 3 or 4 minutes and they've missed all sorts of steps. So I put little highlighted notes about where to change the slide in my notes so that when I'm presenting, I know and I can keep track of what I'm doing. So those are the main ideas about visuals. Now, you do have the option, for instance, if I'm doing something like this and I do have a comic on there, I can give my audience a couple seconds to read it before I begin to speak. So that is another way that you can deal with the visuals, to give them the time to absorb that before I start speaking. So delivery. Delivery is challenging. Many of you may not actually enjoy public speaking. I personally hated it for the longest time, which is interesting given that that's pretty much what I do for a living now. I inevitably turned brilliant red and my throat would close up and I'd get nervous and I'd start sweating and all of those very typical not enjoyable things when you're a little bit stressed. So just as the baseline, I would say one thing is that you get better with time and with practice. There is nothing like practice and practicing in front of people to get to become more comfortable with presenting. When I was at McGill, they actually had a graduate student service, which was basically a presentation group, and you would go and every week you do a little presentation and you would be recorded, and then you had the joy of getting to watch yourself do the presentations and critique your performance and other people would help critique your performance. And it was painful, but a great a great opportunity because we actually don't see ourselves very well. So for instance, I know that I speak quite quickly, and I also know that I can actually slow my speech down quite a bit so that it feels very unnatural to me, but it will still sound fine to you. See, for me, that feels very awkward, but in fact, the audience won't necessarily notice that and may actually get more out of what I'm saying. So with delivery, practice. And this is important. This again goes back to that idea of time, though it's more than that. Practice your presentation. And I mean that literally, don't just sit at your desk and read it. I mean, stand up in front of a mirror and deliver your presentation. First of all, this will get you more comfortable with presenting it. It will make your presentation more natural over time. It will familiarize you with the content. And I know you say, well, I did the research, I know the content, but there's a difference between the content of the research and the content of the presentation. And you do not want to read. So practice. The other big thing that practice does is it allows you to test the timing and to know whether you are remotely within the time allotted. So it's all very well to say that on average, a person speaks at about takes two minutes to get through a page of notes. But we don't all speak at the same speed. We don't all speak with the same types of accents and intonation. And so the best way to get over that hump is to practice. Notes are okay, but do not read. I always have notes. And in part, I have notes because I have an unfortunate tendency to go off on tangents. And if I don't have notes, I can get lost. So I will go off on a tangent and I will lose track of where I am. And the notes keep me on track. Notes are especially helpful if you tend to be nervous, because we all have, well, maybe we don't, but I think many of us have had that situation where you dread, standing up in front of a class or in front of a group of people and having a complete mental blank and not knowing what to say. So notes are absolutely fine. Do not read. There is nothing that is worse than someone who comes up, brings their paper like this. So you see, I do have notes, and just spends like their whole time saying, well, this is how I'm going to do my presentation. And then this is what I found. And that, because first of all, when you read, you don't have the same intonation in your voice. You're not going to have the same vocal modulations. It's not going to be as engaging. You are also not engaging with your audience. You're not connecting with your audience when you read. Reading generally happens when you have too much material that you are trying to get through and not enough time. And people start talking faster and faster and they read faster and faster. I can read your paper. I'm not coming to a conference to hear you read your paper back to me. That's not why I'm here. It is a very different thing. I'm here to hear you speak. So do not read. Now, one trick, and I learned this in law school, is one thing that you can do is you can print your notes only on the top half of your page. This isn't as relevant for an online conference, but it is when you are presenting, for instance, with a podium in front of you. So if I have my notes only on the top half of my page and I'm sitting here, I can look at them like this, as opposed to turning my head and looking down. That means it won't be as noticeable to my audience that I'm actually looking at my notes. So that's just one little tip that I use, and I still use it with teaching as well. I shrink the margins at the top of the page so that the text is moved up. Make the text big, so again, you can see just visually very quickly. I use highlighters and make little stars next to important points, or because I've practiced, if I know that there's a particular place where I tend to lose my train of thought, I will make a little star next to that so I can always come back to it very quickly. So this goes back to being aware of the time. Do not rush your delivery. Again, when you rush, as when you read, what happens is your audience feels that you are not devoting the appropriate time, that you are not well prepared. They also will stop following you. When you start speaking faster and faster and faster, people will tune out. especially if you happen to be presenting at the end of the day, or you are the third speaker on a panel. Again, back to that idea of information overload. So be aware of the time, avoid rushing. You can have a clock or your phone next to you to give you an idea of what the time is, of how long you're going. But again, my own personal suggestion is the best way to deal with this is to practice. If I practice my presentation, I know ahead of time that this talk takes me 9 minutes. And so then I even have a little bit of leeway because I've got 10 minutes to do the presentation. Similarly, or not similarly, but another point is that we actually speak at a different pace when we are presenting than when we speak naturally. So there is a tendency to speak faster, especially if we happen to be a little bit nervous. So that can be good because it means you can actually cover more material. I wouldn't count on it. And remember, of course, as you speak faster, you may lose some people in the audience, especially if you're presenting to an audience that, for instance, has many people for whom English is a second language. I will write little notes to myself in my notes that say slow down and that remind me to slow down because I know that I have a tendency to talk quickly. So that's another thing that you can do. Be aware of your time. In most conferences, you're going to have somebody who's doing the timekeeping, and they will give you notices. If it's a 15-minute presentation, they might give you a notice at 5 minutes, then they'll give you a notice at 2 minutes. And that's when a lot of presenters run into trouble, because if they haven't constructed their presentation within the constraints, they get that 2-minute warning and realize that they're only halfway through their materials, and then they start racing through and skipping slides because they haven't managed their time well. And again, they lose their audience. So try to practice, try to avoid rushing. And that's another important thing that is, it's actually better to leave things out than to rush. So be aware that if you are pushing the time to the very limit, maybe there's a point at the end, 1 or 2 points that you can cut out, or maybe you have an alternative shorter version of your conclusion that you can give. So connecting with your audience, and that means eye contact. It means your voice modulation. So this is challenging when we're doing online presentations. And you might see that I occasionally look over here. And that's because the only thing on my screen that's moving right now is my self view, which happens to be over here, whereas my camera is up here. And this is important when you're giving an online presentation, because of course, especially if you're using, for instance, a laptop, your camera is not in the middle of your screen. And it can be really easy to give a presentation where you look like you're not making any sort of connection with the audience because you're spending all your time looking down here, or worse, if I'm looking at my notes, I'm looking down there. And in that case, if I didn't have the headset, not only would I not be looking at the camera, but I also wouldn't be projecting to it. So when you are giving a presentation, you really do want to make contact with your audience. And this goes back to our discussion about content in terms of engaging them. You can have your notes, but look up, look at your audience every so often. You know, even if that means that you have to pause and I'm looking at my notes and I look up and just say one sentence. And if I have to look back down, that's okay. But it gives your audience the sense that you are aware of them and that you are speaking to them. You aren't just reciting something that you have practiced or not practiced. Speaking loudly. So again, when we're on an online version, that's not necessary. But I'm sure you've been in a room where if it's a big room and the presenter at the front either is too far from the microphone or there isn't a microphone, isn't speaking loudly enough, and you can't hear what they are saying. And again, you're going to lose your audience. People won't clue into what you are saying. So speaking loudly, trying not to speak too fast. For me, that's difficult. You know, I can leave notes to slow down if necessary. But when you're giving a presentation in person as well, that's the same thing. That's why I have those notes at the top of the page, is so that I'm not reading down, I'm not speaking down into my lap, I'm not speaking down. I generally suggest if you are presenting in person and you have the option to stand, standing is better than giving a presentation that is seated. It is more dynamic. You're more likely to, for instance, use your hands. That can be really important. If you are, well, I'll get to specific notes about online presentations in a few minutes. So making eye contact with your audience and not always the same person. So looking around. Try also not to look over the back of the audience. I've had people who I think they were worried about looking at people and they were feeling nervous, but it kind of looked like they were looking at the ceiling or the back wall of the room. And it's what you get then is there's a tendency of your audience wanting to turn around and see what you're looking at. So making contact, remember that the people who are in the audience most of them are not judging you. Most of them have been giving their own presentations and may be equally nervous. And there's nothing like when you're make a good point and you see people in the audience who are smiling or nodding, that's a really affirming sensation or feeling. So making contact with your audience is important. Being aware of your comfort and your body language. So some of us have tics. I discovered one of my own that I had not even noticed, which is that when I stand to present, I have a tendency to cross my legs. I don't have a problem with that, but in this course on how to present, I was told that it made me look very unstable. So that's something that I wasn't aware of, but it's worth noting. In terms of other kinds of tics, I've had students who constantly are brushing their hair out of their face like this. So that is a tic. And again, if you do it once or twice, it's not the end of the world. But if you're doing this for a 15-20 minute presentation, it can get really distracting. Similarly with rocking, if you've been a performer, one trick is to put one foot slightly ahead of the other because it's less noticeable if I rock frontwards and backwards, if I shift my weight that way, than if I shift it side to side. So that's just a little trick that you can have. Again, hand gestures, you don't necessarily want to be very, very stiff. Be aware, try to be as natural as possible in terms of your facial expressions, in terms of your hand gestures, in terms of your body language. And part of that has to do with being comfortable. So wearing clothes that you are comfortable in, that's really important. If you're someone who tends to, for instance, get really hot, well, maybe you want to wear layers so that if the room you're in happens to be really hot, you can take off a layer. Similarly, if you're someone who tends to be cold, again, bringing a sweater. If you are someone who sweats, for instance, well, wearing a dark color so that it doesn't show as much, so that you're not nervous about it, because you don't want to be thinking about those things. If it's possible, if you can get to the room early or go there the day before so that you have an idea of what the venue is like, that's really important. Because also your presentation or your delivery will vary depending on the venue. So if I'm speaking to a group in a small seminar room, my presentation will be very different than if I'm speaking in a 200-person auditorium. I'm going to have to speak differently. I'm going to project differently. All of those things will be different. So that's something to be aware of. Some of it's not within our control. We have a tendency to, we all have little tics that we may not be aware of, and you don't want to obsess too much over it, but it's something just to note, perhaps. There are vocal tics as well. So some people go all the time. We don't like, and if you notice, I just did it there. We tend not to like silence. We feel that silence needs to be filled. So if we lose our space, we have a tendency to try and fill it with some sort of noise. And again, now and then that can be fine, but it can also be quite distracting. A good way to find out what your tics are is, again, to practice and to videotape yourself doing it. It can be kind of painful to watch back, but it's actually a really good exercise, and you don't have to show it to anyone else. So you can also present in front of someone, and they can give you tips and tricks about or at least notice what sort of tics, either vocal or physical, that you have. Now, I have a few notes specifically for online delivery, and here's a really good example. So if I move here, this is a problem. So if you have the option, and unfortunately my computer is stationary and I do not have the option, when you are preparing to do an online talk, be aware of what you are going to look at on, like, what are you going to look like online? So where your various light sources are, and avoid things like that, which is the sun coming in and hitting me directly in my eyes. So having a light behind your presentation is good, or behind your camera. Again, even though this is a virtual presentation, it is a conference presentation. So showing up in your pajamas or with your messy bed behind you may not be ideal. Trying to adjust those things can be quite useful, or at least make you appear much more professional. It doesn't mean that you have to have the bookshelf full of perfectly organized books behind you, but just being aware of some of those things. Another one is what I mentioned about where the camera is. So during COVID, a lot of us have gotten used to presenting online. So this may be nothing new to you, but I was having a lot of trouble when I was recording classes for my students. I was having a lot of trouble not looking down at my notes. I would have my notes either on the screen or down below. And when I didn't look at my notes, I was looking at the screen, but I still wasn't looking at the camera. And so what I did was I actually put a little smiley face sticker up on right next to the camera, so that I would look at that and I would remember that that's where the camera is when I'm giving my presentation. That's just a little minor detail. You can do it or not. It may not matter to you, but it's something to be aware of. The other thing, of course, is when you are presenting at a conference that is virtual, trying to make sure that you have a stable internet connection. I often use a headset because it cuts out on more of the ambient noise. For instance, I'm on a busy hallway. There are people going back and forth. There's people mowing the lawn outside. So being aware of those factors and knowing that they may happen. And so trying to preempt them so that you don't get flustered or rushed in the middle of your presentation or distracted. So if you have a cat, as much as we all like to see cats and dogs, maybe lock them out of the room where you are presenting. So those are the main tips I have for delivery. Now, oops. There you go. Write myself delivery notes in with my conference notes. So this is one instance where I should have put in my notes that I had an extra PowerPoint or an extra notation there. And what I mean by delivery notes are things like saying slow down or speak clearly. They can be just little reminders, especially towards the end, where you might start rushing, both because you see the end in sight and because you, oops, and I have turned on the closed captions. All right, well, we're just going to leave that on then for the moment. And because you see that this is something that is, you're nearing the end of your presentation and you're getting a little bit flustered. So there you go. There's an example of getting a bit flustered. You also have to remember that anyone who is in a conference room has run into these problems. I had a meeting this morning and Zoom decided it wasn't going to work, and you just have to troubleshoot it. And that's where we get to the next slide, which is in fact troubleshooting. So first key is, and this is particularly the case if you are doing an in-person conference, is that bring a backup. Bring a backup of your notes, bring a backup of your presentation, or two. Have it saved on your email. Have it saved on 1 or 2 different USB devices. Have it saved on the cloud. If something goes wrong, you want to be able to access it. Don't expect that someone in the room is going to be able to accommodate that. So bring backups of your notes. I like having my notes as a hard copy, and that's a personal choice. I will say, and I as a bit of an aside, more and more people are presenting at in-person conferences with a laptop. This is I think we're just going to be doing that more. There is something about having a screen in front of you when you are presenting to a live audience that I personally feel creates a physical barrier. So when we talk about connecting, having that physical barrier can be a little bit problematic, or at least it feels very much like the person is not connecting with their audience in the same way. So I generally prefer to have my notes written out, to have them on paper, but that's a personal preference. You can attend a conference, see people doing it different ways, and decide how you feel. I will say that my piece of paper never runs out of batteries. I never have to deal with glare or pop-ups or a program crashing when I have a piece of paper in front of me. So for technology, back up your presentation, bring multiple copies, and be aware that something could happen and you may have to proceed without your visual presentation. That's never fun. Hopefully it won't happen, but it is always a possibility. So it's something that you should at least consider when you are preparing. Time. So we're coming back to that big issue. Time is critical. You may run out of time. There are different ways this can happen. You can potentially not have prepared the appropriate amount of time. That can be one thing. Another thing that can happen is that you thought there were only 3 presenters at the panel, but it turns out that there are 4. And so when you arrive there, the chair tells you that instead of 12 minutes, you have 10 minutes to present. That's really frustrating. It shouldn't happen, but sometimes it does. And this is another reason why you don't want to take for granted how much time you have. So if I have 3 presenters and I have a 45-minute presentation, that doesn't mean that each of the 3 presenters gets 15 minutes. We have to have introductions, their administrative details. We want to have time. There's going to be time to set up between the different presentations so that everyone can pull up their presentation. And ideally, you want to have time for questions. So ask the chair of your panel what the time frame is, how much time you have to present. Design your presentation with that in mind. And still, you can sometimes think about where you can cut. And so this is what I said, for instance, about having 2 different versions of the conclusion, or having a final point that maybe isn't as important as your first 2. So make your important points right at the top so that if you run out of time, you can cut that out. And what I would say is if you've already identified something that you can cut out, then you're not going to be in a situation where you're really, really rushing. You're not going to be, in that place where you have to tap through your PowerPoint slides really quickly. I had a speaker do this on Wednesday. He had prepared a presentation that was much too long for the time allocated. And so for the entire second half of the presentation, he would be like, oh, well, we'll just go through this really fast and skip ahead and skip ahead and skip ahead. And again, what it means is that it feels like it's unprepared and it feels like we are missing really important things. Whereas if you have designed the presentation to start with to address 3 key points, yes, it's not everything, but it will feel like a cohesive whole. So think about what could potentially be cut ahead of time if you run into trouble. And tying into that, as I said, people will tune out if you just try to cram a lot of information at them all at once. So another fear that many people have has to do with the question and answer period. Often in a conference, after the presentations, you will have the opportunity, or there will be the opportunity for the audience to ask questions. Personally, I find this to be the most fun. But many people don't like it. Many people get really nervous. And the fear is always that you're going to get a question that either you don't understand or you don't know how to respond to. Well, the short answer is it doesn't matter. What you need to do is you need to learn how to respond without necessarily giving an answer if you don't have an answer. So if you don't understand a question, ask for clarification. That's an easy one. You can also simply tell your audience that you don't know the answer, or master the art of, that's a really interesting point and I haven't looked at it yet, but maybe we could talk about it after. That way you are validating your audience member by saying that they've asked a really good question and acknowledging your own limitations. It's much better to acknowledge your limitations and the limitations of your research than to try and make up an answer that will sound uncertain or that might actually be wrong. So that's an easy way to deal with that. It still is a little bit unnerving, but that's not the end of the world. The last, or another troubleshooting issue is that there is no audience. Now, some of you may have presented at massive conferences. So I'm thinking about the International Studies Association, maybe the international, I'm trying to think of the political science equivalent, where you have conferences that take over 2 or 3 different hotels that have up to 100 concurrent panels running at the same time. And the reality is that in those situations, sometimes you might be presenting to 1 or 2 or 3 people, and that can be really disappointing. So as long as there's somebody in the audience, think of it as a practice run. It's giving you an opportunity to try to present, to practice your presentation skills. And honestly, if you have just 1 or 2 people who are really interested, sometimes that's all you need. It is hard. It's not ideal. I've actually had a couple situations where, or been in panels where, because there was so few people in the audience, we actually ended up just having a really interesting conversation with the presenters rather than having a more formal presentation. That's not ideal, but be aware that just because there aren't many people in the audience for your presentation does not mean that the work you are doing is not interesting. The reality is that in many of those instances, people go to the conferences, pick a few panels that they're interested in, and then they go sightseeing. But don't tell the people funding your trip that that's what you're doing. So those are my troubleshooting tips. And now I'm going to unshare my screen, stop share. And I'm happy to take any questions that you may have at this point. I see just an affirmation rather than a question. Are there any questions that you'd like to ask me, or do you have any suggestions that you'd like to bring up? I see Friedman has one. Perhaps if you'd like to speak, to say your question, and then we'll move to the people in the chat. Oops, maybe. Hello? Oh, perhaps not. We'll do it in the chat. So Lynn says, I have experience presenting as a practitioner, but less so as a scholar. Do you have any suggestions specific to academic presentations? Are there ways in which scholarly presentations should differ from other types of presentations? For me, I think it comes down to that very first point, which is about what your objective is. So your objective in an academic presentation is less likely to be trying to convince someone, more likely to be presenting your research. In some ways, I'm not sure that there are major differences or major differences between the 2 types of presentations as opposed to each individual presentation. If you're talking about a practitioner presenting to other practitioners, then many of those things will still come in, thinking about who your audience is. What is your objective? I do find that, in an academic presentation, sometimes what you are presenting might be more, for instance, you might talk about the methodology more, or you might have people interested in the methodology. It may be that the questions you are getting are a bit different than what you would get with other practitioners. But I think it ultimately, the presentation skills that we learn are these are soft skills and they apply in different contexts. My first experience learning about presenting and doing workshops on presenting or receiving workshops on presenting was actually in a policy context when I worked at the Department of Justice. But many of the things I learned there are very much applicable to academic presentations. If anyone has any thoughts about that, by all means, feel free to interject. Any other questions? I have one hand up. Yeah, there.
Yes. Good. This Friedman.
Hi there. What's your
Good.
question?
Thanks so much for the presentation.
My pleasure.
You made a reference to a situation where during Viva, sometimes we start presentation and then we rush through. And then you mentioned that sometimes we start from the background objective and then we follow that order. So with your experience, what should we do? Do we have to take some things off, or we should really manage our time? Because should I take objective out? Should I take method out? What should we be doing? Thank you.
Well, so this is again the difference between your written research and your presentation. So in your written research, there are keys. You have to have your methodology, you have to have your literature review, you have to have all of those points. You don't have to have those in a presentation. You get to pick and choose what you want to focus on your presentation. In a longer presentation, I'll talk about methodology, but if I only have 10 minutes, I may have 1 or 2 lines about methodology only. And I might say, if you're interested in in talking about the methodology, that's ask questions after. We can totally talk about that in the discussion period. But what I want to focus on are these 3 conclusions, which are the outcomes of my research. So that's how I would address it. Remember that this isn't, again, you're not presenting your entire research. You're really trying to target a couple of key ideas, and the rest of the presentation, you have that knowledge. And if the audience is really interested in it, then you can discuss it afterwards. Then they can ask you questions about it. You can invite them. If you have a paper that's already been published, you can refer to them to that paper for more information. So don't feel that you need to have all of those different pieces in a conference presentation. Now, it may be that the methodology is a really key part of what makes your research original. And if that's the case, well, then yes, you might have to address it. But for instance, very few people want to hear about a literature review at a conference. That's not your work, that's other people's work. We want to hear what you have done. So that's how I would recommend approaching that challenge.
Thank you so much. It's clear.
My pleasure. So Rachel asked for 10 minutes for CARFMS presentation this year. And do I have any suggestions for chairing panels? I see that we have been recruiting you. I will be sending out, so if you have been recruited as a chair, I will be sending out information about chairing. In this context, chairing is very simple. It's basically introducing the speakers and timekeeping. So you get to be the evil person who tells them that they only have 2 minutes left to present. There's chairing versus moderating. So moderating a panel is where you're actually engaging with the speakers, and that's a much more developed and complicated thing. In this case, it's very much more technical. For CARFMS this year, the length of the presentations is going to depend on how many speakers there are. So I'm actually, for those of you who are are presenting at CARFMS, I am finalizing the conference schedule over the next couple of days. We've had some people who have withdrawn, and so we're having to shift around some talks. And so if you are on a panel that only has 3 people or 3 presentations, you have an hour and a half. So for something like that, I would suggest maybe doing a 20-minute presentation, 15-20 minutes, and leaving time for questions after. One of the most frustrating things is that in a lot of presentations and a lot of conferences is there never seems to be enough time for questions. And often that's the best part of the presentation, because that's where you as a presenter are also going to get some ideas for how to take your research further. So the chairs will be informing you of how much time you have, but you should have a good 15 to 20 minutes depending on the panel. I think there's 1 or 2 panels that have 5 presentations, so that it will be a shorter period of time. Any other questions that you might have? I realize that I've thrown a lot of information at you, and so I'm going to, this is my email address, and if any of you have questions afterwards that you'd like to ask me directly, I'd be happy to answer them. Just give it another minute if anyone has anything else, or if you have any suggestions, any tips or tricks that you might have to present. I would also say, when we talk about those ticks, be careful of pens. There's nothing more annoying than a presenter who is doing this the entire time during their presentation. So be aware of what you are doing with your hands. Same thing with if you have change in your pocket and are jingling your change. Those are things to be aware of. Anyone else? All right. Well, if that is the case, we're finished a little bit early, but I think that nobody, well, if you're around Toronto, I realize many of you aren't, but if you are, it is a beautiful sunny day. So thank you all very much for taking the time. We will be holding a third workshop after the conference. It may be before Christmas or it may be in the early winter, which will be about how to present or how to turn your conference paper into a journal article. And that we will be hosting with Dagmar Sonnenkin, who is the current chief editor of Refuge. So look out for that. It will be posted on all of the CARFMS listservs and the CRS listserv as well. Thank you very much. Ah, yes, multiple screens. Take care.